I didn't cry at my husband's funeral. Not a single tear. The house is quiet now, unnaturally so. The silence is a heavy blanket, smothering the echoes of condolences and the rustle of funeral attire. For hours, this living room was filled with the scents of lilies and baked ham, a cloying combination of grief and obligation. Neighbours from up and down Hemlock Lane, people I've known for half a century, filled these seats. They brought casseroles in foil-covered dishes and spoke in hushed, reverent tones about Leo. They told stories of his high school football days, his first car, his unfailing generosity. They looked at me, his widow of 56 years, with a practiced pity in their eyes, their gazes sliding away when they saw my own were dry. I can still feel their whispers crawling on my skin. Poor Emma, she must be in shock. So cold, so unfeeling. After all those years, you'd think she'd show something. Let them whisper. They are tending to the grave of a man they think they knew. A photograph on the mantelpiece shows him as they remember him. Handsome, smiling, his arm draped easily around my younger self. To Havenwood, Oregon, Leo Miller was a pillar, the son of the great Arthur Miller, a man who built half this town. To them, our marriage was the stuff of local legend, a perfect union. I sit in the worn velvet armchair, its deep green faded to moss at the edges, and run a thumb over the polished wood of the armrest. My hands are wrinkled now. A roadmap of years I never asked for, marked with veins that stand out like blue rivers on dry earth. My gaze drifts to the window, where a persistent Oregon drizzle paints blurry streaks down the glass. The sky is the colour of slate, a lid on a world that feels muted and grey. This weather suits the day, but it does not suit my heart. My heart feels nothing of sadness. It feels like a block of ice, preserved and waiting. They don't understand. I am not mourning the man I married. I am mourning the girl I was before I ever met him. A girl with a laugh that came easily, and a belief in the simple goodness of the world. That girl died a long, long time ago. They buried Leo today, but the monster who truly destroyed my life is still breathing, his lungs still drawing air, his heart still beating in his chest. And he has no idea that his judgment day has been 50 years in the making. My fingers find the cool, smooth band of gold on my left hand. It feels heavier today. It's no longer a symbol of love, if it ever truly was. It is a manacle, a permanent reminder of the gilded cage I walked into on a sun-drenched afternoon when the world still seemed full of promise. The metal is cool against my skin, and as I twist it, the pristine, silent room around me begins to fade. The scent of lemon polish and old books dissolves, replaced by the fragrance of pine needles and wild roses. The grey drizzle outside my window brightens, sharpens, until it becomes the brilliant, warm light of a late summer day. The sun was a benediction. It streamed through the tall pines surrounding the Havenwood Community Church, dappling the lawn where our guests mingled. Laughter, light and carefree, floated on the breeze. It was a day painted in the richest colours imaginable. The deep green of the Oregon forest, the impossible blue of the sky, the vibrant pinks and yellows of the roses that climbed the church's stone walls. And at the centre of it all was Leo. He was 24 and radiated an effortless charm that seemed to warm everyone he spoke to. His smile was quick and genuine, crinkling the corners of his startlingly blue eyes. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and in his tailored black suit, he looked like a movie star who had wandered into our small town by mistake. He held my hand as if it were the most precious thing in the world, his thumb stroking my knuckles in a rhythm that matched the beating of my own heart. Every time he looked at me, I felt like the only person in the universe. "Happy, Mrs. Miller," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. I was 22, and the word happy felt too small for the boundless joy that filled me. I was wearing a dress of white lace and satin that rustled when I moved, and my heart felt like it might burst through the delicate fabric. More than happy, I answered, my voice breathless. I feel like I'm dreaming. This is real, Emma, he said, his smile widening. This is the first day of the rest of our lives. I believed him. Oh, how I believed him. I was a girl from a simple family, a logger's daughter, who had worked at the town diner to save for college. Marrying Leo Miller felt like stepping into a fairy tale. The Millers weren't just wealthy, they were Havenwood royalty. And at its head was the king, Arthur Miller. I saw him then, standing near the great oak tree at the edge of the lawn. He was in his 50s, a handsome, powerfully built man with a mane of silvering hair and the same intense blue eyes as his son. He commanded attention without demanding it. People gravitated towards him, laughing a little louder at his jokes, nodding a little more enthusiastically at his words. He was holding a glass of champagne, and when he saw me looking, he raised it in a toast, a broad, magnanimous smile spreading across his face. Earlier, at the altar, he had hugged me tightly. "Welcome to the family, daughter," he had boomed, his voice warm and resonant. He'd held me for a moment longer than necessary, his large hand resting firmly on the small of my back. "Leo is a lucky man. You'll be good for him. You'll make our family stronger." At the time, I had felt nothing but a swell of pride and gratitude. I was being welcomed, accepted. His touch felt paternal, his words a blessing. I saw only the respected businessman, the loving father, the perfect patriarch. I didn't see the way his eyes weren't just looking at me, but assessing me. I didn't register the proprietary nature of his grip, the way it staked a claim. I was a bride, dizzy with love and champagne, and I saw only what I wanted to see: a perfect man, a perfect son, and the beginning of a perfect life. Leo squeezed my hand, pulling me from my thoughts. "Come on," he said, his voice full of excitement. "Dad bought us a house. A real house, Emma. On Sycamore Hill. He wants to give us the keys. A house. Our own home." It was another dream I hadn't even dared to have, being laid at my feet like a gift from the gods. We walked across the manicured lawn, a sea of smiling faces parting for us. As we approached his father, Arthur's smile seemed to grow even wider. He clapped Leo on the shoulder before turning his full attention to me. "Every young couple needs a place to build their future," Arthur said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. He reached into his pocket and produced a small, ornate silver key. "This will open the front door. The rest is up to you." He didn't give the key to Leo. He pressed it into my palm. His fingers were warm and dry, and they closed over mine for a fraction of a second, his grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you, Arthur," I managed to say, my voice trembling with emotion. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said, his blue eyes twinkling. "Just be happy, and make my son happy." His gaze lingered on me, a steady, unblinking look that felt both warm and intensely focused. Then he smiled again, the perfect patriarch, and turned to congratulate another guest. Holding the key in my hand, with Leo's arm around my waist and the golden afternoon sun warming my face, I felt a sense of absolute certainty. This was it. This was where I belonged. My life, my real life, was just beginning. I had married the man of my dreams and been welcomed into a family that would protect and cherish me. Standing there, bathed in the glow of my own innocent joy, I had no way of knowing that I hadn't just been given the key to a house. I had been given the key to my own prison. The house on Sycamore Hill was more beautiful than anything I had ever allowed myself to imagine. It was a 2-story colonial with crisp white siding and dark green shutters, set back from the road on a half-acre of impossibly perfect lawn. A flagstone path wound its way through beds of hydrangeas to a heavy oak door that opened into a world of polished hardwood floors and the faint, clean scent of beeswax. It was a fortress of quiet prosperity, and it was ours. Or so I thought. In those first few weeks, I floated through the rooms in a haze of blissful disbelief. Leo was attentive and playful, chasing me up the grand central staircase and pulling me into his arms in the sun-drenched master bedroom. We were living a life plucked from the pages of a magazine, a life of effortless grace, funded by the boundless generosity of Arthur Miller. And that was the first thread I should have pulled. Generosity is never boundless. It always comes with a price. The house was fully furnished. Arthur had seen to that. Heavy, masculine pieces of dark mahogany and leather filled the living room. The dining table could seat 12. The kitchen was a gleaming marvel of modern appliances. It was all impeccable, all expensive, and none of it was us. I remember standing in the living room one afternoon, a stack of my worn paperback novels in my hands, looking for a place to put them. Every surface was already occupied by leather-bound classics and silver-framed photographs of the Miller family through the years. There was no empty space. There was no room for me. We should get some new bookshelves, I'd said to Leo that evening, trying to sound casual. Something lighter, maybe, to brighten up the room. He'd looked up from the newspaper, a slight frown on his face. What's wrong with the ones we have? Dad had them custom built. Nothing's wrong with them, I said quickly. They're beautiful. I just thought we could make the place our own, you know. It is our own, Em, he'd said, his smile returning, dismissing my concern as a silly whim. Dad gave it to us. And that was the answer to everything. Leo saw his father not as a benefactor, but as a natural extension of his own life, a source of power and wisdom from which he drew his strength. He had worked at Miller Construction since he was a teenager, and I learned quickly that his career path was as meticulously planned by Arthur as the landscaping outside our front door. I once found a portfolio of his old drawings from high school sketches of innovative, beautiful houses full of light and sweeping lines. They were wonderful. "You're so talented, Leo," I told him, tracing the lines of a house that seemed to float among the trees. "Why did you stop drawing?" He'd shrugged, a flicker of something regret passing through his eyes so quickly. I thought I'd imagined it. Just a high school hobby. Dad said, "The real money and power are in development, in owning the land and putting up the buildings, not just designing them." He set me up as a project manager, right out of college. It's a much better path, much more secure. He spoke the words as if they were his own, a conclusion he had reached through careful thought, but I could hear the echo of his father's voice in the confident, practical tone. Arthur's shadow didn't just fall over our home and our careers, it covered our finances too. When I suggested we open a joint bank account, a simple act of partnership for a newly married couple, Leo looked at me with genuine confusion. "Why would we do that?" he'd asked. "Dad's accountants handle all of that. We're part of the Miller Family Trust. We get a generous monthly allowance paid right into my account. It's all taken care of, Em. You never have to worry about a thing." I wanted to worry. I wanted to have a say. I wanted to be a partner, not a well-cared-for dependent. But when I tried to explain this, he'd just laughed and pulled me close. "My wife," he'd said, kissing my forehead. "Always so serious. Let my father worry about the money. That's what he's good at. Our job is to be young and in love." It was hard to argue when he put it that way, when he smiled at me with those devastating blue eyes. I told myself I was being ungrateful, that any woman in Havenwood would kill to be in my position. So I learned to quiet the uneasy fluttering in my stomach. I learned to smile and nod. Arthur was a frequent visitor in those early months. He never called ahead. The roar of his Cadillac turning into our driveway would be the only warning. "Just checking in on you kids," he'd boom, striding through the front door as if he owned the place. Which, of course, He did. He'd walk through the rooms, his sharp eyes missing nothing, pointing out a lawn that needed edging, or a window that needed washing. Leo would follow him like an eager puppy, nodding and taking mental notes. It was during these visits that I began to feel a different kind of chill. Arthur's paternal affection started to feel different when it was directed at me. He'd place a hand on my arm when he spoke, and it would linger there just a moment too long. He'd stand a little too close in the kitchen, his body heat radiating against my back as I stood at the sink. His compliments, which had once made me blush with pride, now felt coated in something oily. "That colour brings out your eyes, Emma," he'd say. But his own eyes would trail down the front of my dress and back up again, slow and deliberate. If I took a step back, he would simply smile, a knowing, wolfish grin that made me feel like he'd won a small, secret game. Leo never seemed to notice. Or if he did, he saw it as his father's charming, old-fashioned way. The unease crystallized into genuine fear during a family dinner one Sunday evening. It was a weekly tradition, held at Arthur's imposing stone and timber mansion on the highest point of Sycamore Hill. The house was like him, large, impressive, and designed to make you feel small. That week, I had gathered my courage. I'd spent a day at the hardware store, collecting paint swatches and fabric samples. I was determined to bring some warmth and light into our living room, to carve out a small piece of that house for myself. I chose shades of butter yellow, soft sage green, and warm cream. I found a floral chintz fabric that reminded me of my grandmother's cottage. Holding the samples in my hand, I felt a spark of hope. This was something I could do. This was something I could control. I waited until after the main course, when the brandy was being poured. My hands were trembling slightly as I laid the paint chips and the fabric swatch on the polished mahogany of the dining table. "I had some ideas for the living room," I began, my voice brighter than I felt. "I thought we could paint it a warm yellow to make it feel a bit sunnier and maybe get some new curtains." Leo looked at the samples, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "That's nice, Em." I turned to Arthur, seeking his approval, the way a child seeks a parent's praise. "What do you think, Arthur?" He picked up the yellow paint chip, holding it between his thick thumb and forefinger. He looked at it for a long moment, a thoughtful expression on his face. Then, a slow smile spread across his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile of pure condescension. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at his son. "Leo," he said, his voice a low, amiable rumble. "A man must be the head of his house. It's his domain. You can't let a woman's whims empty your pockets with foolish things like paint and curtains every time the mood strikes her." He tossed the paint chip onto the table. It spun once before landing, a tiny, bright square of defiance in the vast, dark expanse of wood. "The room is fine as it is. It was decorated by a professional." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A hot flush crept up my neck and burned my cheeks. I felt the eyes of everyone at the table on Leo's mother, his sister, their husbands, all of them silent, all of them witnesses to my humiliation. I looked at Leo, pleading with my eyes for him to say something, to defend me, to claim me as his partner. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He looked from his father's smug face to my stricken one. For a heartbeat, I saw a struggle in his eyes. Then, it was gone. He cleared his throat and forced a short, nervous laugh. "Dad's right, I guess," he said, avoiding my gaze. "We should be practical. The room is fine." And just like that, I was erased. My opinion, my desires, my very presence in that house was reduced to a woman's foolish whim. I wasn't a partner. I was a decoration. And a decoration doesn't get to choose its own colour. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I excused myself as soon as I could, claiming a headache. The drive home was thick with a silence that felt louder than shouting. I sat pressed against the passenger door, watching the dark trees flash by, waiting for an apology, an explanation, anything. It never came. Leo hummed along with the radio, seemingly oblivious to the chasm that had just opened between us. When we walked into our perfect house, it felt different. It felt cold. The dark furniture seemed to loom in the shadows. The high ceilings felt oppressive. This wasn't my home. It was a museum of Arthur Miller's taste and a monument to his power. I was just another one of his acquisitions, and my husband was the willing security guard. That night, as I lay in the dark beside Leo, listening to his steady breathing, I understood for the first time that I wasn't just married to him. I was married to his father, and I was trapped in the deep, suffocating shadow he cast over everything. After the night of the dinner party, the air in our beautiful house grew thin and cold. A fragile, unspoken truce settled between Leo and me. On the surface, things returned to normal. We ate breakfast together. He went to work at his father's company, and he came home expecting dinner. But underneath, a permanent chill had set in. I was quieter. The easy laughter he'd fallen in love with was gone, replaced by a guarded watchfulness. He noticed, of course, but he chalked it up to me being in a prolonged sulk over the decorating incident. He thought if he ignored it, my mood would eventually pass, like a patch of bad weather. He had no idea it wasn't weather. It was a change in the climate of my soul. I began to live my life by a new set of rules, all centered around one goal: avoiding Arthur. If I knew he was coming for Sunday dinner, a sudden migraine would confine me to our bedroom. When his Cadillac pulled into the driveway for a surprise visit, I would feign being busy in the garden or engrossed in laundry in the basement. I created a map of my own home, marking the safe zones and the danger areas, my movements dictated by the movements of the man who was supposed to be my father. Leo saw my avoidance as antisocial and ungrateful. "Dad just wants to be involved, Emma," he'd say, a note of frustration in his voice. "Why are you always hiding? It's insulting." "I'm not hiding. I would lie," my voice flat. "I'm just busy." He didn't press. It was easier for him to believe I was being difficult than to confront the terrifying alternative. We were living in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, but we were miles apart, separated by a truth I couldn't speak, and he refused to see. The silence between us grew, filled with my unspoken fear and his willful ignorance. The gilded cage was beginning to rust, and the isolation was becoming unbearable. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in October. The leaves on the maple trees had turned a fiery red, and the air had the crisp bite of autumn. Leo had called early in the evening to say he'd be home late. A big project for a new housing development was behind schedule, and his father wanted the management team to stay until the supply logistics were sorted out. "Dad's really cracking the whip on this one," he'd said with a laugh that held a note of pride at being included in his father's inner circle. After hanging up, I felt a wave of relief so profound it made me dizzy. The house was mine for the evening. No need to be on guard. No need to listen for the sound of an approaching engine. I made myself a simple dinner of soup and toast, curled up on the sofa with one of my novels, and for the first time in weeks, I felt myself relax. The house was quiet, a peaceful sanctuary. I must have drifted off. I awoke with a start to the sound of a car door slamming shut outside. My heart leaped into my throat. It wasn't Leo's Ford. The sound of the engine was deeper, heavier. It was the low, predatory rumble of a Cadillac. I sat frozen, the book sliding from my lap. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. Maybe he'll just leave something on the porch. Maybe he won't knock. But the heavy, confident footsteps on the flagstone path told me otherwise. 3 loud, commanding knocks echoed through the house. For a moment, I considered not answering. I could hide upstairs, pretend I wasn't home. But he knew Leo was at the office. He knew I was here, alone. Not answering felt more dangerous than answering. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I walked to the door and opened it. Arthur stood on the porch, silhouetted against the deepening twilight. He was smiling his familiar, charming smile. "Emma," he said, his voice smooth. "I apologize for the late hour. I was just coming from the site and remembered Leo mentioned you had a leaky faucet under the kitchen sink. Thought I'd take a look while I was in the neighborhood. A good landlord keeps his properties in order." The excuse was so plausible, so helpful, that it made my fear feel irrational. It was an offer of kindness, but my instincts screamed at me. I wanted to tell him it was fine, that Leo could fix it, but the words wouldn't come. My silence was his invitation. He stepped past me into the entryway, bringing the cold night air and the scent of expensive cologne into my home. "No trouble at all," he said, already heading towards the kitchen as if he'd been invited. "Won't take a minute." My feet felt like lead, but I followed him, my body moving on some sort of horrified autopilot. I stood by the kitchen table, wrapping my arms around myself, as he opened the cabinet under the sink and peered inside. The room was unnervingly bright and sterile under the fluorescent lights. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic pounding of my own heart. He fiddled around for a minute before pulling his head out. "Well, I don't see a leak," he said, straightening up and wiping his hands on a handkerchief. He turned to face me, his large frame seeming to shrink the spacious kitchen. "Must have fixed itself. Thank you for checking," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I just wanted him to leave. He took a step towards me, his smile fading slightly, replaced by an expression of mock concern. "You look tired, Emma. Is my boy working you too hard?" "I'm fine." He took another step. He was close now. Too close. I could see the tiny lines around his blue eyes, the silver stubble on his jaw. He was close enough that I had to tilt my head back to look at him. "You're a wonderful girl, you know that?" he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. "Leo is a lucky boy." I was trapped, my back against the edge of the kitchen counter. There was nowhere to go. "But sometimes," he continued, his voice a conspiratorial whisper, "a boy doesn't know what to do with a real woman." His hand came up, not to my arm, but to my back. It wasn't a brush. It was a deliberate, firm pressure on my lower back, a gesture of shocking intimacy and ownership. The warmth of his palm seeped through the thin cotton of my dress, branding my skin. It was a violation so profound, so terrifying, it broke through my paralysis. A strangled gasp escaped my lips. I shoved him, hard, with both hands against his chest. The force of it surprised both of us. He stumbled back a step, a flicker of genuine shock on his face, before it was replaced by a dark, ugly scowl. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and fled. I ran through the dining room, my heart hammering against my ribs, and up the stairs. I didn't stop until I reached our bedroom, slamming the heavy door shut behind me and twisting the lock. The click of the bolt sliding into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I collapsed against the door, my body shaking uncontrollably, listening as his footsteps slowly, deliberately, walked back to the front door and out of the house. Hours passed. I sat on the floor in the dark, my back pressed against the door, my mind a whirlwind of terror and shame. But underneath the fear, a desperate hope began to form. This was different. This wasn't a dismissive comment or a look that lasted too long. This was physical. This was a line that could not be unseen, could not be misinterpreted. This time, Leo would have to believe me. When I finally heard his Ford pull into the garage, I unlocked the door and waited for him in the hallway, my entire body trembling. He walked in, looking tired but pleased with himself. "Long night," he said, loosening his tie. But I think Dad was impressed. He stopped when he saw my face in the dim light of the hallway. Em? What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost. The story spilled out of me. A frantic, jumbled mess of leaky faucets and whispered words and the feel of his hand on my back. I was crying now. The tears I'd held back for months finally breaking free. I grabbed his arm, my fingers digging into his sleeve. You have to believe me, Leo. Please. He touched me. I watched his face change. I saw the initial concern, the flicker of confusion. I saw him trying to process my words. And then I saw the shutters come down. His expression hardened, his jaw tightened, and his eyes grew cold, pushing me away. He pulled his arm from my grasp. Stop it, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Leo, please. Just stop it, Emma, he exploded, his voice echoing in the quiet house. He wasn't looking at a victim. He was looking at an inconvenience, a problem that threatened the neat, orderly world his father had built for him. My father would never, he shouted. His face contorted with a fury I had never seen before. He was here to fix the sink. He was trying to help us. And this is how you repay him, with these fantasies. He took a step towards me, his finger jabbing the air. What is wrong with you? Are you trying to drive a wedge between me and my family? Is that what this is? Are you that unhappy here? He stared at me, his chest heaving, waiting for an answer. But I had no words left. In that moment, the last sliver of hope inside me died. The perfect image of my marriage, already cracked and tarnished, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He didn't see me. He didn't see my terror or my pain. He saw a liar, a hysteric, an enemy. He shook his head in disgust, turned without another word, and walked into the guest room at the end of the hall, closing the door firmly behind him. I was left standing alone in the hallway, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I was a prisoner, and my husband was not my ally. He was my warden. The door to the guest room remained closed for 3 days. It was a solid oak barrier, a silent testament to the choice Leo had made. We moved through the house like ghosts, occupying the same space but existing in different worlds. I'd hear the floorboards creak in the hallway as he left for work, and I'd wait until the sound of his car faded before I dared to venture out of our bedroom. The air was thick with things unsaid. His accusation of me being hysterical hung between us, a toxic fog that poisoned everything. On the 4th day, he moved his things back into our room. There was no apology, there was no discussion. He simply placed his folded clothes back in the dresser and acted as if nothing had happened, offering me a brittle smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had decided on his strategy: benevolent denial. He would treat me like a patient recovering from a temporary madness, a delicate thing that might shatter if handled too roughly. His kindness was a cruelty, a constant, unspoken reminder that he believed I was the one who was broken. I was trapped. Where would I go? Back to my father's small logging town, my tail between my legs, admitting that the fairy tale life everyone envied was a lie. What would I even tell them? That my powerful, respected father-in-law had made a pass at me and my husband didn't believe it. They would have looked at me with the same pity and disbelief as Leo. I had no money of my own, no power, no allies. My prison had invisible walls, but they were as real and as strong as stone. Arthur understood this. He understood it better than I did. He now knew for certain that my keeper was on his side. My resistance in the kitchen had not been a deterrent. It had been an invitation. He had tested the lock on my cage and found it broken. The escalation began subtly, a quiet campaign of terror designed to break me down piece by piece. His unannounced visits continued, but now there was a new, terrifying charge in the air. He would arrive on Saturday mornings, just after Leo had left for his weekly trip to the hardware store. I took to locking the doors the moment I heard Leo's car pull away, but it was a futile gesture. He had a key to the house he had gifted us. The sound of that key turning in the lock was the sound of my blood running cold. He'd walk in, smiling, holding a bag of groceries or a newspaper. "Thought you might need this," he'd say, his voice resonating with false generosity. And then he would begin his slow, deliberate torment. He would walk through the house, trailing a hand along the furniture, his eyes following me everywhere I went. He would trap me in conversations, asking about my day, my thoughts, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. He was asserting his ownership of the space, and of me. The first time he assaulted me, it was in the laundry room. It was a small, windowless space in the basement, smelling of damp concrete and bleach. He had followed me down under the pretense of checking the water heater, his heavy footsteps echoing on the wooden stairs behind me. He cornered me between the washing machine and the wall. I opened my mouth to scream, but he was ready. "Go on," he whispered, his voice a chillingly calm murmur against my ear. "Scream. Let's see who comes running. Let's see who they believe. The man who built this town, or his sad, unstable little daughter-in-law, who has fantasies." Ugh. His words struck me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. He was right. I was powerless. My voice died in my throat. As his hands began to move over me, a strange and merciful thing happened to my mind. The damp, grey walls of the laundry room seemed to recede. The scent of bleach faded. The terrifying reality of his touch grew distant. I mentally floated up, out of my own body, and hovered somewhere near the ceiling, watching the scene unfold below as if it were happening to someone else. I focused on a spiderweb in the corner, studying its intricate, dusty design. I counted the pipes running along the ceiling. 1, 2, 3. I was a spectator to my own violation, my mind's desperate act of self-preservation. Dissociation. I didn't know the word for it then. I only knew it was the one place he couldn't reach me. This became my survival. The assaults grew more frequent, more brazen. He orchestrated opportunities with the skill of a master strategist. He'd invent errands that required my help, tasks that Leo would pressure me to perform to prove I wasn't still being difficult. "Dad needs you to pick up his suit from the dry cleaners, Emma. It's the least you can do. Dad's hosting a dinner for the mayor. He needs you to go over and help polish the silver." Each command from Leo was a death sentence, delivering me into his father's hands. The assaults happened in the hallowed quiet of his study, amidst the smell of old books and cigar smoke. They happened in the bright, cheerful kitchen of my own home, while the afternoon sun streamed through the windows. Once, he insisted I drive him to a doctor's appointment in the next town, and the violation took place in the close, suffocating confines of his Cadillac, parked in a secluded corner of the hospital parking lot. Each time, he would whisper to me, his words a poison, meant to paralyze my soul. "Leo doesn't know how to appreciate a woman like you. He's still a boy. This is our little secret, Emma. A special bond between us. You know you like it. A real man knows what you need." Afterward, I would stumble through the rest of my day like a ghost. I would go through the motions of being a wife cooking dinner, cleaning the house, smiling when Leo told me about his day. The man I had married would sit across the table from me, cheerfully oblivious, while the scent of his father's cologne still clung to my skin. Some nights I would stand in the shower for an hour, scrubbing myself with scalding water, trying to wash away the feel of his hands, the memory of his whispers. I'd scrub until my skin was raw, but I never felt clean. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger, her eyes hollow, her face pale and drawn. I lived in a state of constant, high-alert dread. Every ring of the phone, every car that slowed on our street sent a jolt of pure terror through me. The beautiful house on Sycamore Hill was no longer a home. It was a stage for my private horror show. The lush green lawn, the pristine white siding, the charming shutters, they were all parts of the set, a perfect facade for the unspeakable things that happened within. I was an actress in a play about a happy marriage, but when the curtain fell and I was alone, I was simply a prisoner, waiting for the warden's next visit. There was no escape. There was only the waiting. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon, a day so ordinary it felt like a special kind of cruelty. The sky was a placid, cloudless blue. A neighbour was mowing their lawn. The drone of the engine, a familiar, comforting sound. Leo was at work. I was in our bedroom, folding clean laundry, the scent of sunshine and fresh cotton filling the air. It was a moment of domestic peace, so fragile I was almost afraid to breathe. He must have come in through the back door, because I never heard the front. I only knew he was there when his shadow fell across the bed. I turned, my heart seizing in my chest. Arthur stood in the doorway of our bedroom, my bedroom, his smile as calm and proprietary as ever. This was a new, unspeakable violation. The kitchen, the study, his Carthos were his territories. But this room was my sanctuary. It was the only place in the house that felt like mine, the one space I had managed to fill with my own things, my own scent. It was where I slept, where I dreamt, where I hid. And he had invaded it. "Don't stop on my account," he said, his voice a low purr. He walked into the room, his heavy shoes silent on the plush carpet. "It's good to see you keeping the home fires burning." I stood frozen, a folded towel clutched in my hands like a shield. My mind began its familiar retreat, searching for the corner of the ceiling to float to, but something was different this time. The sanctity of this space had been breached, and my mind refused to abandon it. I was trapped, fully present in my own body, in my own room, with him. He didn't need to corner me. The room itself was the trap. He walked over to the dresser and picked up a silver-framed photo of Leo and me from our wedding day. "He's a good boy," he said, looking at the picture, not at me. "But he's soft. He doesn't have the appetite that a real man has. The Miller appetite." He put the photo down and turned to face me. The smile was gone. His eyes were flat and hard. "He doesn't deserve you," he said. "He doesn't even know what he has." What happened next was a blur of methodical, soul-crushing violation, made 1,000 times worse by the setting. It happened in the room where my husband and I were supposed to be partners, on the bed where I was supposed to be safe. Through it all, his words were the sharpest weapon, carving away what little was left of my spirit. He told me this was inevitable. He told me this was what I was for. He told me that I belonged to him, that the entire Miller legacy, from the company to the house to the son, was his, and I was just another one of his assets. When he was finished, he stood up, adjusted his tie, and smoothed his suit jacket. He looked down at me, a crumpled heap on the pristine bedspread, with an expression of cool satisfaction. "We'll talk again soon," he said, as if concluding a business meeting. And then he was gone. I lay there for a long time, listening to the drone of the neighbour's lawnmower, a sound from a world I no longer belonged to. The dissociation that had saved me before had failed me. I had been present for every second, and the horror of it was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. Something inside me didn't just crack, it shattered. I knew with a certainty that transcended all logic and fear that I could not survive another day of this. I had to try one last time. When Leo came home that evening, he found me sitting on the living room sofa in the dark. I hadn't moved from the bed for hours, until I heard his car in the driveway. I hadn't showered. I hadn't changed my clothes. "Emma?" Why are all the lights off? He asked, his voice holding the forced cheerfulness he always used with me now. I didn't answer. I just looked at him. He switched on a lamp, and the soft light illuminated my face. He recoiled. I can only imagine what he saw. Not an angry wife, not a hysterical accuser, but a ghost. A woman hollowed out by a terror so profound it had consumed her from the inside. My God, Em. What happened? He whispered, his feigned cheerfulness vanishing, replaced by genuine alarm. He rushed to my side, kneeling in front of me. My voice, when it came, was a dry, rasping whisper. I told him. I didn't have the energy to cry or to plead. I just laid the facts out, one by one, my voice devoid of all emotion. I told him about the laundry room, his study, the car. I told him what had happened that afternoon. In our room, on our bed. I watched his face as I spoke. I saw the familiar denial start to form, the tightening of his jaw. But this time, something was different. My utter brokenness, my deadened voice, the vacant horror in my eye-sit was too real for him to dismiss as hysteria. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and for the first time a flicker of doubt about his father ignited in his eyes. He saw the truth. In our room? He stammered, his face paling. The idea, the location, had somehow pierced his armor. I just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. A wave of pure fury washed over his face. It was a side of him I had never seen, a righteous anger that was terrifying and, for a single foolish moment, beautiful. He wasn't angry at me. He was angry for me. That son of a bitch, he snarled, scrambling to his feet. That goddamn son of a bitch. He stormed towards the front door, grabbing his car keys from the hook. Leo, where are you going? I whispered. I'm going to end this, he said, his voice shaking with rage. I'm going to his house. I'm going to end this right now. He slammed the door behind him, and the house fell silent again. But this time, the silence was different. It was filled with a fragile, terrifying hope. He believed me. He was going to protect me. My husband was going to save me. I wrapped my arms around myself, rocking back and forth on the sofa, praying with an intensity I hadn't felt since I was a child. I allowed myself to imagine it. Leo returning, his face grim, but resolved, telling me to pack a bag, that we were leaving Havenwood, leaving his father, leaving this nightmare behind forever. We would start over. We would be free. The minutes stretched into an hour. The hour stretched into 2. The hope inside me began to curdle, replaced by the familiar cold dread. With every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, I could feel his resolve slipping away. I could feel his father's influence, like a powerful tide pulling him back under. I pictured the scene. Arthur's calm denials, his feigned woundedness, his masterful manipulation turning Leo's righteous anger into confusion, then doubt, then shame for ever having believed me. When I finally heard his car in the driveway, nearly 3 hours after he had left, I knew before he even walked through the door. He didn't look at me. He walked to the liquor cabinet and poured himself a whiskey, his movements stiff and deliberate. His face, which had been alive with fury when he left, was now a cold, empty mask. All the light, all the anger, all the empathy was gone. He took a long swallow of the whiskey before finally turning to face me. My father explained everything, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, as if he were reciting a script. He said you came on to him, that you're lonely and unstable. He said he's been trying to protect me, and you, from your own delusions. He took another drink. He forgives you. For my sake. The words didn't even feel real. They were a parody of betrayal, a lie so monstrous it was absurd. I stared at him, my shattered heart turning to dust in my chest. He walked over to the fireplace, refusing to meet my eyes, and delivered the final, killing blow. He spoke the words that would echo in my mind for the next 50 years, the sentence that defined the rest of my life. "You will never speak of this again," he said, his voice as cold and hard as granite. He finally turned to look at me, his eyes empty of any recognition, any love, any shared history. "I choose my father. I choose my family." Oh, life after the ultimate betrayal was a study in silence. The house on Sycamore Hill, once my prison, became my tomb. I moved through its beautiful sunlit rooms like a wraith, my feet making no sound on the thick carpets, my presence leaving no impression. Leo and I were planets in a dead solar system, held in a cold, predictable orbit around the gravitational pull of his father, but never touching. He was a model husband to the outside world. He remembered my birthday, bought me flowers on our anniversary, and held my hand at church. In private, he was my keeper. He watched me with a cautious, clinical eye, monitoring my moods, my silences, my every move. He was ensuring I kept my end of the bargain, the one he had made for me. I would never speak of it again. In return, I was allowed to exist in the gilded cage he and his father had constructed. I had given up. The fight had drained out of me, leaving behind a profound, hollow emptiness. My days were a grey, featureless landscape of domestic chores performed on autopilot. I felt nothing. It was a mercy. Numbness was a shield, a thick layer of ice over a wound too deep to ever heal. I thought I would live out the rest of my days in that frozen state, a ghost haunting the perfect life I was supposed to have. Then, my body betrayed me. It began with a subtle, persistent nausea in the mornings, which I dismissed as a symptom of my own misery. Then came the bone-deep weariness that had me asleep on the sofa by 8 o'clock each night. I attributed it all to the crushing weight of my despair. But one afternoon, as I was changing the linens on our bed, a wave of dizziness washed over me so suddenly that I had to sit down. I sat there, my head between my knees, waiting for the world to stop spinning. And in the sudden, echoing silence of the room, a thought, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, pierced through my numbness. I walked to the calendar hanging in the kitchen, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. My eyes scanned the neat, empty squares of the past month, and then the month before. Time had become a blur to me, but the simple biological clock of my own body was undeniable. My hand, trembling slightly, went to my stomach. It was flat, unchanged, but I knew, beneath my hand, in the deepest, most secret part of me, a life had taken root. Horror was the first feeling, a cold, absolute horror that made the blood drain from my face. A child conceived in this house of secrets and lies, a child of this poisoned family tree. The thought of it, the biological reality of it, was a nightmare. I saw Arthur's face, his triumphant smile, and I felt a fresh wave of nausea that had nothing to do with morning sickness. But then, as I stood there frozen in the silent kitchen, another feeling flickered to life. It was small and fragile, a tiny, foolish spark in the vast, suffocating darkness. It was hope. It was an insane, desperate hope, born not of logic, but of pure, primal instinct. My mind, in a profound act of self-preservation, pushed aside the terrifying possibility of the child's paternity. It refused to consider it. Instead, it clung to a different narrative. A lifeline in a sea of despair. The baby was Leo's. It had to be Leo's. And if it was Leo's, then everything could change. This wasn't just a baby. This was a chance. This was a reason for Leo to finally become a man. A father. He couldn't choose his own father over the mother of his child. Could he? He couldn't look at his own son or daughter and allow this horror to continue. The reality of a baby, his own flesh and blood, would have to be enough to sever the puppet strings Arthur used to control him. This child would be my savior. This child would be my shield. This child would force my husband to protect me. I held on to that hope like a drowning woman clutches a piece of driftwood. It was the first thing I had felt besides numbness in months, and the warmth of it, however illusory, was intoxicating. I told him that night. I waited until after dinner, my hands clammy, my heart pounding. "Leo," I said, my voice quiet. "I'm pregnant." "Oh." He looked up from his newspaper, his expression unreadable. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw the sequence of emotions play across his face. First, pure, blank shock. Then, something else. The flicker the script mentioned. A look I couldn't decipher. It wasn't joy. It wasn't excitement. It was a complex, shadowy mixture of fear and a rapid, chilling calculation. His eyes darted from my face, down to my stomach and back again. He understood in that instant the terrible, unspoken ambiguity of it all. He knew what his father had been doing. He knew the child might not be his. And his first reaction was not to comfort me, but to assess the potential damage. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice strained. "Yes," I whispered. "I'm sure." He stood up, ran a hand through his hair, and began to pace the room. He didn't come to me. He didn't touch me. He just paced. A caged animal of his own making. Finally, he stopped and looked at me, his face grim. I have to tell my father." The fragile hope inside me faltered. Of course. His first instinct was not to turn to his wife, but to his father. Still, I clung to my fantasy. I told myself he needed his father's advice, his support. He was gone for less than an hour this time. When he returned, he was not alone. Arthur was with him. Arthur's face was a mask of pure triumph. He strode into our living room, his chest puffed out, a conquering hero returning to claim his spoils. He ignored Leo completely and walked directly to me. "Emma, my dear girl," he boomed, his voice overflowing with false warmth. "Leo has just told me the wonderful news. A Miller heir. This is a great day for our family." He reached out, and before I could flinch away, he placed his large, warm hand directly on my stomach. It was a gesture of blatant ownership, a brand seared onto my skin. He was claiming me, and the life inside me, as his property. He looked from my stomach up to my face, his eyes gleaming with a victory so absolute it was terrifying. He had won. In that moment, I saw the true nature of my hope. It had not been a key to unlock my cage. It had been the final, heavy bar slamming into place, locking me in forever. I was no longer just a victim he could toy with and discard. I was the vessel for his legacy. The pregnancy did not make me safer. It made me more valuable to him. It tethered me to him with a bond of biology and blood that could never be broken. I looked past Arthur's triumphant face to my husband, who stood silently by the door, watching. There was no joy on his face. There was no pride. There was only the dull, resigned expression of a man who had chosen his side and knew he would have to live with the consequences. He had handed me, and his potential child, over to his father without a fight. My hope had been a fool's dream. This baby wasn't my shield. It was my life sentence. The 9 months that followed were the longest, most surreal ordeal of my life. My pregnancy was not a private journey. It was a public spectacle, orchestrated and directed by Arthur Miller. He treated the coming baby like the most important project his company had ever undertaken. Suddenly, my health was his primary concern, not out of any genuine care for me, but because I was the vessel carrying his legacy. He insisted I see a doctor of his choosing, a stuffy old man named Dr. Albright, whose office was filled with photos of him shaking hands with the governor. I knew, without being told, that Dr. Albright would report every detail of my health directly to Arthur. Gifts began arriving at the house daily. An obscenely expensive crib made of dark cherry wood that matched the rest of our funereal furniture, boxes of maternity clothes from the fanciest department store in Portland, a silver rattle engraved with the Miller family crest. Each gift was a tightening of the leash, a beautifully wrapped reminder of my debt and my dependency. In the eyes of Havenwood, I was the luckiest woman alive. I was glowing, pampered, and cherished. Arthur would parade me around town, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back or, as I grew larger, directly on my stomach. "We're expecting great things," he would announce to his business associates, his voice booming with pride, and they would all nod and smile, congratulating him as if he were the one performing this miracle. Leo played his part with practiced enthusiasm. In public, he was the doting father-to-be, fetching me glasses of water and speaking with wonder about feeling the baby kick. But in the quiet of our home, he was a ghost. He treated my growing belly with a strange, fearful reverence, as if it were an unexploded bomb. He never touched it unless we were in the company of others. He never spoke to the baby. He was watching a play, just as I was. And we were both waiting, with our own separate dread, for the final act. My own connection to the life inside me was a tangled knot of terror and a fierce, primal protectiveness. I never spoke of the thought that haunted my every waking moment, the question that was a constant, silent scream in my mind. Whose baby is this? To survive, I had to build a wall around that question. This was a child, an innocent, and it was mine to protect, regardless of the sin that had conceived it. I felt no joy, none of the blissful anticipation other expectant mothers spoke of. I only felt a grim, desperate resolve. I would bring this child into the world, and I would love it, and I would be its shield, even if I was a shield made of broken pieces. The birth itself was a cold, clinical affair. The hospital room was sterile and white, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic. Leo was by my side, holding my hand, his knuckles white. His touch offered no comfort. It felt like the grip of a guard, ensuring I didn't flee. He whispered words of encouragement, but they were hollow, lines fed to him from a script he didn't believe in. And Arthur was there. Not in the room, but his presence was a palpable weight just outside the door. He had driven us to the hospital. He had spoken to the doctors. He was the commander overseeing the battlefield. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, I knew he was out there, waiting to claim his prize. When she finally arrived, a messy, screaming, beautiful little miracle, the first thing I felt was not a rush of maternal love, but of overwhelming relief. She was here. She was safe. She was real. The nurses cleaned her and wrapped her in a soft pink blanket, and when they placed her in my arms, I looked down at her tiny, perfect face and knew I had to give her a name that was clean, a name that had no part of the ugliness she came from. "Lily," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Her name is Lily." Leo just nodded, his face a mask of sweat and strain. He looked at the baby in my arms with a kind of awe, but also with a profound, unbridgeable distance. The nurse smiled. "Lily Miller. It's beautiful. Lily Miller." The lie was born. It had a name, it had a weight, and it was mine to carry for the rest of my life. The days that followed were a waking nightmare of performance. Our house on Sycamore Hill was flooded with flowers and well-wishers. The women of Havenwood arrived with gifts and advice, cooing over Lily's dark hair and blue eyes, eyes that were a perfect match for her father's and her grandfather's. I had to smile. I had to accept their congratulations. I had to play the part of the blissful, tired, new mother. Every smile was a Herculean effort. Every word of thanks felt like a betrayal of the truth. The chasm between the happy scene everyone saw and the screaming terror inside my own head was so vast I thought it might swallow me whole. The true torture began with Arthur's visits. He was a doting grandfather, a role he played with chilling perfection. And the scene I had dreaded, the one that played over and over in my nightmares, became a recurring reality. He would walk into the room, his eyes fixated on the bassinet. "Let me see my granddaughter," he would say, his voice soft. And I would have to watch as he lifted my daughter from her bed. He would hold her with a practiced ease, his large, terrifying hands cradling her tiny body. He would look down at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated ownership. This was his creation, his bloodline, his victory. "She's a true Miller, isn't she?" he'd say, looking at me over her head, his eyes gleaming. "Look at that chin. All Miller. There." And I would have to nod and force a smile onto my face, my heart withering inside my chest. Every time he held her, every time he called her my granddaughter, a piece of my soul turned to ash. I was forced to witness my violator cradling the evidence of his crime, and I had to applaud the performance. The lie was no longer just a secret I had to keep. It was a script I had to live, a part I had to play every single day. Leo was no help. He treated Lily with a hesitant, almost fearful affection. He would hold her when prompted, but he always seemed relieved to hand her back to me. He was as haunted by the question of her paternity as I was. But he had chosen his path. He would live in ignorance, performing the role of father, just as he performed the role of husband. My love for Lily was the one true thing in my life. It was a fierce, desperate, protective love, but it was tainted by the poison of our reality. I would rock her to sleep in the dead of night, in the silent house, and I would whisper the truth to her, the only person I could tell. "I love you," I'd cry, my silent tears falling onto her blanket. "I love you more than anything. I am so sorry." I was trapped in the most complete and intimate way imaginable. I was a mother, a role that was supposed to mean love and joy, but for me, it meant being chained forever to the two men who had destroyed me. We were a family, a perfect, happy family to the world. And every single day, I had to give a standing ovation to the beautiful, soul-destroying lie we had created. The years that followed were not measured in days or seasons, but in the growth of my daughter. Time was the hem of Lily's dress rising from her ankles to her knees. It was the missing front teeth replaced by larger, permanent ones. It was the sound of her learning to read, her small finger tracing the words in a picture book. She was the sun around which my dark, silent world revolved. I sank into a state of quiet, functional despair. I was a model wife and mother. I ran the house with a quiet efficiency that was praised by the other women in Havenwood. I baked for the school fundraisers, volunteered in the library, and sewed Lily's Halloween costumes by hand. I created a perfect, orderly life on the surface to compensate for the chaos that raged within me. My love for Lily was a fierce, desperate thing. The one pure emotion I had left. It was an island in an ocean of numbness. With everyone else, I was distant. With Leo, I was a polite and accommodating roommate. With Arthur, I was a ghost, my face a placid mask that betrayed nothing. The terror of those early years had subsided into a chronic, low-grade fear. Arthur remained the doting grandfather, a constant presence in our lives. He spoiled Lily with extravagant gifts, taking her for pony rides and buying her dresses that were far too expensive for a child to play in. He was a pillar of her childhood, and every time he hugged her, every time she ran to him shouting, "Grandpa," the wound inside me would tear open just a little wider. I learned to live with the constant dull ache of it. I had accepted my fate. This was my life. There was no escape. I had forgotten what it felt like to even hope for one. The glimmer appeared on a rainy Wednesday in November. Lily was at school. Leo was at work. Arthur's wife, a woman who lived in a state of willful, sherry-fueled ignorance, was hosting a major charity gala that weekend. As was often the case, I had been volunteered to help. My task was to sit in Arthur's study, the dragon's lair itself, and address hundreds of invitations, cross-referencing the guest list with his personal Rolodex. I hated that room. It smelled of power and secrets, of stale cigar smoke and old leather. The walls were lined with dark wood bookshelves filled with law books and biographies of powerful men. A large, imposing portrait of Arthur's father hung over the fireplace, his eyes seeming to follow me. I always felt small and insignificant there. A servant girl brought in to perform a menial task. I worked for hours, my hand cramping as I carefully wrote out names and addresses in my best cursive. To my right, on the edge of the massive mahogany desk, was a tall, precarious stack of ledgers and file folders Arthur had told me not to touch. I was reaching for a new box of envelopes when my sleeve caught the edge of the topmost folder. The stack wobbled for a heart-stopping second and then tumbled, cascading onto the floor with a series of loud slapping sounds. Papers and folders scattered across the Persian rug. Panic seized me. My first thought was of Arthur's anger. He was a man who demanded order, and I had created a mess in the heart of his sanctuary. I scrambled from the chair, my heart hammering against my ribs, and began frantically gathering the scattered papers. It was then that I saw it. It was different from the standard, professionally printed accounting ledgers from his business. This was a smaller, personal notebook, bound in dark green leather. It had fallen open on the floor, its pages filled not with typed columns, but with dense, handwritten script. My eyes snagged on a line. It wasn't a standard entry. It read, RP Lot 7 minus $15 K, HC Timberline. The next line had another set of initials, another location, another sum of money. There were dozens of pages, all filled with the same cryptic codes. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but after years of living in a house of secrets, I had learned to recognize the shape of one. This was not a record of his public business. This was something else. This was something hidden. A cold, electric thrill shot through me, a feeling so alien I barely recognized it. It was a spark of pure, unadulterated instinct. My hands shook as I restacked the other folders. I placed the green leather notebook back in the middle of the pile where it belonged, but my gaze kept darting back to it. For years, I had been the one with the secret, the one with the shame that had to be hidden. And here, lying on the floor, was one of his. An impulse, wild and reckless, rose up in me. I couldn't take the book. He would know. It would be missed immediately. But a single page, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. With trembling fingers, I opened the notebook again to a page in the middle, one that was dense with entries. I looked towards the office door, listening. The house was silent. Taking a sharp breath, I carefully tore the page out. The sound of the paper ripping was like a gunshot in the quiet room. I didn't dare look at what I'd taken. I folded it quickly into a tiny, tight square and shoved it deep into the pocket of my slacks. I closed the book, put the last of the folders on top, and placed the stack back on the desk, my hands leaving damp prints on the polished wood. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of adrenaline and fear. When I finally returned to my own home, the small, folded square in my pocket felt like a burning coal. I waited until Leo was asleep, until the house was cloaked in the deep, quiet darkness of a suburban night. Then, I crept to the hall closet. I reached to the very back, behind the neat row of coats we used every day, and pulled out the one I never wore. It was a heavy wool winter coat, a relic from the first year of our marriage, long since out of style. I took it into the bathroom and locked the door. With a small pair of sewing scissors from my mending kit, I carefully snipped the threads of the seam in the thick satin lining. My fingers were surprisingly steady. I pulled the tiny, folded paper from my pocket and slipped it inside the coat, pushing it deep into the padding. Then, with a needle and a spool of black thread, I meticulously sewed the seam shut again, my stitches small and neat, indistinguishable from the rest. I hung the coat back in its place in the darkness of the closet. I had no plan. I had no idea what the cryptic codes on the paper meant. It was just a page of gibberish, a meaningless string of letters and numbers. But it was his. It was a secret I held, not one that was held over me. Standing there in the silence, my hand on the rough wool of the old coat, I felt something I hadn't felt in nearly a decade. It wasn't happiness, and it wasn't hope. It was the faintest glimmer of power. It was a single, sharp stone, saved for a day I couldn't yet imagine. It was a start. The silence in the house after Lily left for college was a different kind of silence. It was no longer the tense, watchful quiet of a home with a terrible secret, but the vast, hollow echo of an empty nest. For 20 years, my daughter's presence had been the sun that warmed my frozen life. Her laughter, her questions, her simple, vibrant existence had been my reason for breathing. Now, she was gone, building a life for herself in a city far away, blessedly free of the poison of Havenwood. And I was left alone in the tomb with Leo. Decades had passed. I was in my late 60s, a woman who had faded into the town's scenery. The neighbours saw me as the quiet, slightly melancholic Mrs. Miller, a devoted wife who tended her roses with meticulous care. They saw a frail old woman. They forgot that still waters run deep, and my waters were a frozen abyss, waiting for the thaw. My marriage to Leo had long ago settled into a cold, silent arrangement, a partnership of shared habits and unspoken truths. He was now a senior vice president at Miller Construction, his hair greying at the temples, his face etched with the permanent, weary tension of a man who had sold his soul for a comfortable life. He was still his father's man. Arthur, in his old age, had not softened. He had hardened, his arrogance calcifying into a kind of brittle invincibility. He was the untouchable patriarch, a living legend in his own mind. His decades of secrets buried so deep, he had forgotten they were even there. The fear he once inspired in me had long ago curdled into a cold, hard stone of hatred in my gut. The thaw began with a casual cruelty. It was Lily's 21st birthday, and we were at Arthur's house for the obligatory family dinner. I had just gotten off the phone with her, my heart full of the sound of her happy, confident voice. I mentioned that she was thinking of applying to graduate school for landscape architecture. Arthur let out a short, dismissive laugh. A gardener? We spent all that money on her education so she could play in the dirt. She gets that from your side of the family, Emma. No ambition. He said it with a wave of his hand, as if dismissing a servant. He looked at me, his eyes holding the same familiar contempt, a casual reminder that in his world, I would always be the logger's daughter, the foolish whim. Something inside me, something that had been dormant for 30 years, snapped. It was the insult not to me, but to my daughter, the one pure thing in my life. That night, I went to the back of my closet, took out the old winter coat, and for the first time in decades, I carefully snipped open the lining and removed the small, folded page. Looking at the cryptic codes, I made a decision. The waiting was over. My first step was the most terrifying. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed an ally. But an ally in Havenwood was an impossibility. So I invented one. I told Leo I was joining a weekly art history class in Portland. It was an hour's drive away. He barely looked up from his paperwork. "That's nice, dear," he'd said, pleased by the harmless, matronly nature of the hobby. But I wasn't driving to a museum. I was driving to a discreet professional building in a quiet suburb, to the office of Dr. Isabella Rossi. I had found her after weeks of secret research at the public library. She specialized in trauma, and her office was far from the prying eyes of my world. Walking into her office for the first time felt like stepping onto another planet. For nearly 40 years, I had not spoken a single true word about my life to another human soul. I sat in the comfortable armchair opposite her, a kind-faced woman with intelligent, compassionate eyes, and I couldn't speak. The silence stretched for 10, then 20 minutes. Finally, she spoke, her voice gentle. "Sometimes," she said, "the silence is the heaviest thing we carry. You can set it down here, whenever you're ready." And the dam broke. It wasn't a flood, but a trickle. I started not with Arthur, but with the dinner party. The story of the paint chips, a small, safe humiliation. Week after week, I drove to my art class. And piece by piece, I set down the story of my life. I finally spoke of the assaults. I spoke of Leo's betrayal. I spoke of Lily's conception. I spoke of it all. Dr. Rossi never flinched. She listened. And when I was done, she gave me the one thing Leo never had. She gave me validation. "Emma," she said, her voice firm, "you were not hysterical. You were not unstable. You were a victim of a monstrous crime. And you survived. Your silence was not weakness. It was a shield, but you don't have to carry it anymore." Her words were water on parched earth. She gave me permission to own my anger, to see my resilience, not as coldness, but as strength. She helped me understand that my desire for justice was not a thirst for vengeance, but a need for balance, for the world to be set right. It was Dr. Rossi who helped me see that the quiet, invisible woman I had become was not a weakness, but a weapon. I was the silent witness, and it was time for me to prepare my testimony. My mission began. I used my invisibility as a cloak. I started volunteering more at the church, which put me on the organising committee for the annual charity bake sale, chaired as always by Arthur's wife. This gave me legitimate access to their house twice a week. While she and the other women gossiped over tea in the kitchen, I would offer to retrieve things from the attic or the basement. "Oh, let me get that box of old tablecloths for you, dear. You shouldn't be on the stairs." And in the dusty, forgotten corners of their home, I found his secrets. In a box of old tax returns from 2 decades ago, I found the name of a shell corporation I recognized from the cryptic ledger page. In a filing cabinet in the basement, I found the original, undervalued deeds for a series of properties the town had sold for a pittance, properties now home to lucrative Miller construction developments. I didn't take anything. I had bought a small digital camera, and I photographed everything, my hands steady, my heart cold with purpose. I brought Leo his forgotten lunch at the office once a week, an act of wifely devotion that no one questioned. While he was in a meeting, I'd chat with his secretary. A careless invoice left on a copier, a project file left on a desk, each one was a small piece of the puzzle. At night, in my sewing room, my own private sanctuary, I assembled my case. I hid a large corkboard in the back of a wardrobe. On it, I pinned the original page from the ledger, surrounded by printouts of the photographs I had taken. I drew lines with red yarn, connecting names to properties, dates to transactions. A pattern of systemic fraud began to emerge, a breathtakingly arrogant scheme of kickbacks, money laundering, and real estate manipulation that had been going on for decades. I bought books on forensic accounting and corporate law, hiding them on my shelves between books on rose cultivation and classic literature. I was no longer a victim waiting in the dark. I was a hunter. I moved through my quiet, ordinary life, smiling my placid smile, pouring tea for the man who had destroyed my life, all while silently, patiently, and meticulously plotting his complete and utter ruin. He saw a frail old woman. He didn't see the silent witness, gathering the evidence that would soon burn his entire world to the ground. The telephone call came on a Tuesday. It was Arthur, his voice booming with a self-congratulatory warmth that always set my teeth on edge. The final permits for the Havenwood downtown plaza had been approved. It was the crowning achievement of his long career, a massive redevelopment project that would cement the Miller family name in the town's history for a century. There would be a special dinner on Sunday to celebrate. Attendance was not optional. In the past, an invitation like this would have filled me with a familiar, sickening dread. But as I hung up the phone, I felt nothing of the sort. Instead, a strange, cold calm settled over me. For 2 years, I had been gathering my evidence, my silent testimony. My corkboard in the wardrobe was a spiderweb of connections, a detailed map of my husband's and father-in-law's corruption. I had everything I needed. I had just been waiting for the right moment to strike. This dinner, I decided, would be it. It was fitting. My public humiliation had begun at his dinner table. His ruin would begin there too. I was no longer the frightened girl being dragged to the slaughter. I was the strategist, accepting an invitation to a final parley before laying siege to the enemy's castle. Sunday arrived, cloaked in a deceptive autumn beauty. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the trees lining Sycamore Hill were a riot of gold and crimson. As we drove to Arthur's mansion, Leo was more animated than I had seen him in years, chattering excitedly about the plaza project, about his father's genius, about the legacy they were building. He was a prince praising the king, oblivious to the fact that their entire kingdom was built on a foundation of lies, a foundation I was about to shatter. Arthur's house was ablaze with light, a beacon of success and power. The dining room table was a spectacle of wealth. It was draped in heavy damask linen, set with gleaming silver and crystal that reflected the light of a dozen candles. The air smelled of roast beef and expensive wine. Leo's mother, her face softened by sherry and denial, greeted me with a kiss that never touched my cheek. His sister and her husband were already there, their faces masks of fawning adoration. I took my seat, a silent observer at the feast of the corrupt. I watched them all with the detached clarity Dr. Rossi had helped me find. I saw the desperate need for approval in Leo's eyes as he hung on his father's every word. I saw the practiced ignorance of his mother as she steered the conversation away from anything unpleasant. I saw the naked greed of his sister and her husband, parasites clinging to Arthur's great whale of success. For 40 years, I had been one of them. Tonight, I was the anthropologist, studying the bizarre and final rituals of a doomed tribe. Arthur was in his element. He held court at the head of the table, his voice booming, his gestures expansive. He recounted the story of the plaza deal, a heroic narrative of him battling against petty bureaucrats and visionless council members to bring prosperity to Havenwood. He was the hero of his own story. The wine flowed freely, and with each glass his arrogance swelled. Finally, after the plates were cleared and the port was poured, he pushed back his chair and rose to his feet, holding his glass aloft. The moment had come. "A toast," he began, his voice ringing with authority. "To the future, to the Miller legacy, which with the downtown plaza will stand for generations." He paused, his eyes sweeping over his family. But a legacy is not built of brick and mortar alone. It is built on a foundation of something stronger. It is built on loyalty. And as he said the word loyalty, his eyes settled on me. There was a smug, triumphant glint in them, the look of a man who enjoyed reminding his subjects of their place. "It is built on knowing who you are and where you come from," he continued, his gaze still locked with mine. "Some people are just born to be a part of a great family, to have that strength in their blood." He took a small, deliberate sip of his port. "While others," he said, a cruel, knowing smile playing on his lips, are just lucky to be invited in. The insult, so public, so elegantly delivered, landed with surgical precision. It was the same message he had been sending me for my entire adult life. You are nothing. You are here by my grace. You are an outsider. The other family members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting down at their plates. The silence was thick with my humiliation. My gaze flickered to Leo. This was it. The final test in a lifetime of failures. After all these years, after everything, would he finally defend the honor of his wife? The mother of his child? I watched as he looked from his father's smug face to my own. I saw a flicker of discomfort, a brief shadow of shame. Then, it was gone. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head, a nod, a tiny gesture of concession, of agreement. He was still choosing his father, and in that moment the last shred of hesitation I ever had vanished. It was not a storm of rage that washed over me. It was a clarifying, absolute calm. The final question had been answered. The last doubt had been extinguished. The path forward was no longer just a possibility. It was a certainty. I picked up my own wine glass, raised it slightly in a mock toast to Arthur, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I held his gaze, my expression as placid and unreadable as a frozen lake. He thought he was delivering the killing blow. He had no idea I was the one holding the axe. The rest of the dinner passed in a silent film. I smiled. I nodded. I listened to their chatter. But my mind was elsewhere. I was in a post office, placing a thick manila envelope on the counter. I was watching it slide through the slot, a final, irrevocable act. On the drive home, Leo was in high spirits, still basking in the glow of his father's success. He hummed along with a song on the radio, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. He was sitting next to the architect of his family's destruction, the executioner of his entire world, and he was utterly, blissfully unaware. The supper was over. It was time for the reckoning. The morning after the Last Supper, I awoke before dawn. The house was cold and still. Leo slept soundly beside me, a soft snore escaping his lips, oblivious. I slipped out of bed, my movements silent and deliberate, and went to my sewing room. My war room. There was no rage in me, no trembling fury. There was only a profound and crystalline sense of purpose. I took the corkboard down from its hiding place inside the wardrobe and laid it on my large cutting table. The red yarn connecting the names, dates, and properties looked like the veins and arteries of a diseased heart. Arthur's heart. Methodically, I began to assemble the packages. I had made 2 complete sets of all my evidence. High-quality photocopies of the ledger pages. Crisp, clear photographs of the fraudulent deeds and cancelled checks. Copies of the incriminating invoices I'd found at the Miller construction offices. I had spent a year learning to think like an investigator, anticipating their questions. I created a simple, typed glossary of terms, a key to unlock the cryptic codes on the original page I had stolen so long ago. RP, Lot TT, Ridge Pine Development, Lot TT, HC, Timberline equals Havenwood County Timberline Sale. I was not just giving them clues. I was handing them a confession, written in the language of numbers and transactions. I separated the documents into 2 identical stacks and slid them into 2 thick, sturdy manila envelopes. I addressed them in neat, impersonal block letters, one to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, the other to the White-Collar Crime Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 2 different arrows, aimed at the same corrupt heart. I didn't seal them yet. That was a final act I would save for the very last moment. My cover story for Leo was simple. My art history class was taking a special all-day field trip to the Portland Art Museum to see a new exhibit. It was the perfect excuse for a long absence. "Have fun, dear," he'd said. barely looking up from the morning paper. His dismissal, once a source of pain, was now my greatest asset. I drove north. I didn't just leave Havenwood. I left Oregon entirely. I crossed the Great Bridge over the Columbia River into Washington, the grey-green water churning below. The drive was a strange, suspended moment in time. The world outside my car window, the passing trucks, the dense pine forests, the small, sleepy towns, seemed distant and unreal. My entire focus was on the two envelopes lying on the passenger seat beside me. Two bombs waiting to be detonated. For decades, my life had been defined by inaction, by a silent, passive endurance. This journey, every mile I put between myself and my home, was an act of profound, terrifying agency. There was no going back. I chose a small, forgettable town about 2 hours' drive away. It had a modest post office on a quiet main street. I parked, took a deep breath, and finally sealed the envelopes, my tongue tasting the bitter glue. Inside the post office, the air smelled of dust and old paper. A tired-looking woman with kind eyes smiled at me from behind the counter. "Just these two," I said, my voice steady. I placed them on the scale. The weight of them felt immense, far heavier than the paper they contained. They were weighted with 50 years of pain, humiliation, and rage. I paid for the postage in cash, and with a final definitive thump-thump, the clerk pushed them through the slot into the bin behind her. They were gone. They were out of my hands and in the hands of the federal government of the United States. A giddy, terrifying sense of release washed over me. The secret I had carried, the weapon I had forged, was no longer mine. It had been unleashed. The drive home was dreamlike. I was an ordinary woman, driving an ordinary car on an ordinary day. No one looking at me would know that I had just signed the death warrant for a powerful man and his entire dynasty. The waiting was the hardest part. A week passed. Then 2. Life continued with its monotonous rhythm. Leo complained about a new building inspector who was being difficult. Arthur boasted on the phone about breaking ground on the plaza project. On the surface, nothing had changed. I began to feel a sliver of doubt, a cold fear that my package had been dismissed, lost in a sea of bureaucracy. The first tremor came on a Wednesday morning, nearly 3 weeks after my trip. I was watching the local news while I had my morning coffee. The anchor, a cheerful woman named Brenda, was reporting on a minor zoning dispute.